This is the Divorce Education Series presented by Findling Law. I'm Daniel Findling, and in this webinar we're going to talk about legal separation. When we talk about legal separation or being legally separated, there are really three types of agreements that we're talking about. A private agreement, which is essentially both a husband and wife deciding we're going to separate. Here are the terms and conditions by which we're going to separate. A separate maintenance agreement, which is a lawsuit that one party brings against the other, like a divorce, except you remain married. And a postnuptial agreement, which is really my favorite for a number of reasons. Primarily, it's the only legal separation agreement where you can still be insured, maintain health insurance with your spouse. There's a lot of other advantages as well. Let's go into great detail as to each of these three. So one party says, I think we need time apart, maybe we should separate. All right, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a private agreement? Well, it's a trial divorce, so I guess that's an advantage. Many private agreements resolve. That is, you do separate and you get back together and everything works out okay. But what happens if somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do? Maybe your private agreement is that your spouse is going to pay the mortgage, you're going to pay the utilities, or the children are going to remain with you for this time being, whatever the case may be, and then one party doesn't want to live up to their end of the bargain. You can't go to court to enforce it. And it could also have legal implications. Now, I mentioned this children, and it really does have significant legal implications if a case turns into a divorce with children and one party wants custody. Let me paint the example for you. You decided to separate, and maybe the children are going to reside with your spouse, and a month or two goes by, things break down, and someone files for divorce. But you really want custody. Now, the court's going to take a look at the notion that you've been separated and the children are residing with the other parent to give that parent preferential treatment in a child custody case. It's called an established custodial environment. And that's why most lawyers tell you, don't move from the marital home, especially if you have minor children, unless you work out parenting time beforehand in writing, preferably with a lawyer. So separating, just separating, without any legal documentation can have its advantages and disadvantages. The primary disadvantage, of course, is that it's not enforceable in court and there could be legal applications or implications, excuse me. Of course, an advantage is that it's free and generally it works out. You don't need lawyer. All right, a separate maintenance agreement is a lawsuit, okay? It is a trial divorce, it's enforceable, both parties must agree. Essentially what you do is you file for divorce, but you call it a separate maintenance agreement. And you divide assets and liabilities in the same way that you would if you were to file a divorce, except the parties, of course, remain married. Now, you still must file separate tax returns under IRS rules when you're living separate. And both parties must agree to a separate maintenance agreement. If one party wants a separate maintenance agreement and the other party wants to get divorced, you're getting divorced. But we divide property and debts the same way as a divorce. You can remain on life insurance in many instances or surviving spouse benefits and pension. And if things don't work out, you can, of course, set aside, if the separate maintenance agreement doesn't work out, you can always convert it to a divorce. And if you reconcile, well, then you can dismiss and set aside the separate maintenance agreement. Okay, now one of the primary disadvantages of a separate maintenance agreement is health insurance. We used to do a lot of separate maintenance agreements at Findling Law because one party needed to have insurance. They wanted to get divorced, but if you got divorced, there just weren't enough resources. Maybe somebody had an incurable disease and they were uninsurable. So the solution was to do a separate maintenance agreement, have the parties live separately as if they were divorced, and you can secretly keep someone on insurance. You can't do that under most instances anymore under a separate maintenance agreement. Now, when I write it requires a breakdown in the marriage relationship, what I really mean that the ground for separate maintenance, which is identical to the ground for a divorce, that there's a breakdown in the marriage relationship. A postnuptial agreement really is the best of the three in most circumstances. And in fact, almost every circumstance. What you do in a postnuptial agreement is you file for divorce. You enter into this agreement and then you dismiss the divorce. Now, most people have heard of prenuptial agreements. The end is essentially the same. You have this agreement that says, if we divorce in the future, here's what it's going to look like. In a prenuptial agreement, that's before you get married. In a postnuptial agreement, it's essentially the same agreement, but it's done after you're married. Now, it's a trial divorce, it's enforceable, it's a private contract, the parties must agree. You divide property and debts any way in which you like. Okay, under most circumstances, you must file separate tax returns. All the advantages that we saw here of a separate maintenance agreement. You can remain on your spouse's health insurance under a postnuptial agreement. It's the primary advantage of a postnuptial agreement is that you can remain on your spouse's health insurance and there's no public record. This is a private agreement. When you do a separate maintenance agreement, there's a court filing. Not only is that court filing public record, but the agreement itself is public record. In a postnuptial agreement, everything remains private. So here's a nice summary slide, and I'll go through it. If you look at it, they're all three a trial divorce, whether it's a private agreement, a separate maintenance agreement, or a postnuptial agreement, they're enforceable, except for a private agreement. Separate maintenance agreement and postnuptial are enforceable. Your property and debts can be divided. Well, you know what? Because it's not enforceable in a private agreement, the answer is no. But you can file in a private agreement a joint tax return because it's a private agreement. There isn't a court filing. Under a separate maintenance agreement or a postnuptial agreement, you must file a separate tax return. Now, the other advantages, of course, is health insurance. Both a private agreement and a postnuptial agreement allow you to remain on your spouse's health insurance. But remember, a private agreement is not enforceable. But under a postnuptial agreement, it is enforceable. So if somebody changes their mind, you can still do something about it. Now, filing of a lawsuit, filing of a court case. Under a private agreement, it's your private agreement. Of course, there's no lawsuit. A separate maintenance agreement we described is a lawsuit. In a postnuptial agreement, we do something tricky, and that's why you see both the check and the no sign. The check is that you file for divorce, but then you dismiss the divorce after you enter into the postnuptial agreement. So the only court filing is that a divorce has been filed, but everything else remains private. There is no public record under a postnuptial agreement. Of course, there's no public record under a private agreement because it's private, but there is under a separate maintenance agreement. So if you review all the advantages and disadvantages, in virtually every case, you're going to turn to a postnuptial agreement as the appropriate mechanism to be legally separated. Now, of course, it's inevitable that you're going to have questions. We want to be here for you. I'm providing you my contact information. Of course, my phone number's on the screen, toll free. You can email me. You can visit us at thedivorceguy.com. You can also visit me at Divorce Forum, divorceforum.com. Be more than willing to offer a free consultation to anyone. And thank you. Please call if you have any questions.